So once again, our top story this morning, Willie, Iran.
Yeah, two sides telling very different stories of what's going on right now. The United States and Iran continue to send conflicting signals ahead of possible peace talks as the ceasefire deadline looms. There are some signs of progress this morning. A foreign diplomat inside Tehran, close to the talks, tells MS Now an Iranian delegation led by the country's parliamentary speaker and foreign minister will travel to Islamabad today for negotiations with the U.S., but only if Vice President J.D. Vance is there. Two U.S. officials, meanwhile, tell the New York Times Vance is expected to leave Washington for Islamabad today. Pakistan also actively preparing for a second round of talks, deploying thousands of additional security personnel across the area. Both parties, however, ramping up their rhetoric ahead of a potential meeting. Iran's parliamentary speaker posted to social media yesterday, writing, "We do not accept negotiations under the shadow of threats," adding Iran is, quote, prepared to reveal new cards on the battlefield. President Trump, meanwhile, told Bloomberg he is highly unlikely to extend the ceasefire if a deal is not reached before tomorrow night, that's Wednesday night, Eastern time. When asked by PBS News what happens if the truce does expire, the president said, quote, then lots of bombs start going off. So, Richard Haass, you are a resident diplomat. Help.
Not saying much.
Help. Yeah. I mean, we can catalog and we have all the contradictory statements that have come from the White House and from Iran, but particularly from President Trump, about how things are going, when the war is going to end, when these talks will happen, when they'll wrap up, when there will be peace in our time. What should someone sitting at home watching this make of what you're hearing right now?
I would stop listening to those comments. Quite honestly, he's devalued the currency of presidential statement, and all these threats, I don't think, impressed the Iranians. What if we hit 13,000 targets or something? So if we hit 500 more, it's almost so what? They've shown that they can take a punch. They've shown their resilience, and many times also, as you all know, he backs away. So I don't think that's helping. And by putting pressure on Iran, it actually makes it slightly more difficult for them to be forthcoming at the negotiating table. A big part of the Iranian approach to negotiations is one of what you might call of dignity. I've negotiated with them myself several times in the past. One of the reasons they want the vice president there is a sign of respect and of level of the talks. They also, shall we say, have some issues with Messrs. Kushner and Witkoff, given that the last two times they led talks, it was in some ways a cover for the launching of military attacks. I think the other big problem, Willie, besides the gap on the issues, the substance, is the Iranian delegation. This, one of the things no one seems to have thought of in this long shot hope for regime change is that by killing so many people, we have totally disrupted the hierarchy of decision making in Iran. You have more radical people coming to the fore. So what you have is an erratic U.S. side, an Israeli side that's essentially uninterested in peace, and an Iranian side that's more radical and divided. It's not clear who has the authority to make peace. That is not, shall we say, a great context for peace talks to take place.
Yeah, the attempt to kill their way, and from the United States side, out of this problem, kill the regime, has only made it more extreme.
100%.
So what is on the table? Let's say these peace talks do happen in Islamabad. Let's say Vice President Vance does arrive. Iran says, okay, great, the vice president's here, let's talk. What is even on the table? What's between those 40-yard lines that they might agree on to put an end to this war?
There's two principal issues, and then there's any number of other things. Two principal issues are the strait, getting end of the blockade, getting the Iranians to back off their quote-unquote control of the strait, one thing. Second of all, the nuclear issue, how to deal with the nuclear material, how to deal with the future of the Iranian nuclear program. And the president yesterday putting out a post essentially suggesting that we're prepared to negotiate and accept limits that, shall we say, look a little bit like some of the previous limits. Then there's issues like the relaxation of sanctions, return of frozen assets, questions of Iranian conventional military forces, ballistic missile programs, which was the biggest Israeli concern before this war, drone programs, things like that, their support for proxy groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, and so forth. So you've got the two principal issues, again, the nuclear and the strait. Then you've got a host of additional issues that actually may complicate things. If we are actually, big question, if they are to be resolved as part of this process.
Jonathan Lemire, what are you hearing from the White House? I mean, this seems at this point that this has gone longer than President Trump would desire. Has the White House sort of misinterpreted how much control they would have over the situation?
Oh, significantly so. President Trump was initially of the belief this was going to be a conflict that would be over in a matter of days, a couple weeks at most, similar to what we saw in Venezuela, and that they would be able to prop up a more conciliatory leader there. That, of course, not the case. And to what Richard just said, even harder line, leaders are now in place in Tehran, at least for the moment. And it's unclear. There's also a split there in their leadership and how much of there is an appetite for them to want negotiations. And the Strait of Hormuz is certainly the key. And it's just unclear what Iran would do to give up the leverage they have. That seems a pretty firm line for them. They're willing to open it, but they want to collect a toll. And therefore, the White House, at least for now, is saying that's unacceptable, which would mean they'd leave the war at the end of the war with more control than they had it at the start, which would certainly be a loss for Washington. And then there's the political angle of this. And for that, let's bring in Politics Bureau Chief and Senior Political Columnist at Politico, Jonathan Martin, now with us. J-Mark, good to see you.
Hey, John.
The vice president here is an unlikely figure at the center of this. But I think that may be why, in fact, the Iranians want to talk to him. To Richard's point, he is, the second most powerful person in the government. So that is a sign of respect. But he's also someone who, frankly, had real reservations about this conflict in its early days. And his team made clear that we all heard about those reservations in the conflict in its early days. So there's a sense here that he might be a more reasonable voice, to get to a deal to end the war. But it's also, look, yes, there's 2028 in the looming over the horizon as well. Talk to us, if you will, about the Vance role here and, frankly, the pressure that he has.
Well, yeah, for one, the Iranians do think that they're getting prestige and they're getting proximity, right? Somebody who does have the ear of the president and somebody who's got a big title. Secondly, as you pointed out, they believe that they're getting the biggest dove in the room, which is to say, the person in the West Wing who is the most eager for diplomacy, who is less enthusiastic about combat. So there are those two things. What's striking is that everybody here domestically in the States is looking at this as a classic VP assignment, John, which is to say not the best gig in the world, because typically the VP gets the hardest job. And that gets to the heart of what you're asking, which is, boy, if Vance can't deliver here, or if Vance delivers a bum steer, this is not going to help his, frankly, already difficult straits looking at trying to run in 2028 in the wake of Donald Trump. It's always hard for a VP to run in his own right. As you guys know, only George H.W. Bush in '88 has pulled it off immediately after the president they served. So it's already difficult. You're trying to solve this Rubik's Cube. It is really difficult. And I think Trump wants to find any way to declare victory. But you and I know that in 2 years, Trump's version of declaring victory could look a little less, well, shall we say, victorious in hindsight.
Let's bring in the conversation defense editor at The Economist, Shashank Joshi. His latest work in the war is titled, Which Iran is America Dealing With? It's great to have you with us. Take us inside, if you will, the perspective of the Iranian regime right now. I know you say there's some signs of fraying there, but as they approach these negotiations, they've withstood 8 weeks of war here. They found this new leverage point in the Strait of Hormuz. How are they viewing these negotiations?
Well, good morning. Thank you for having me. My colleagues have done some excellent reporting from inside Iran. And the picture we get is a cacophony. It depends which Iran are you talking to. If you look at the last delegation that the Iranians sent to Islamabad, it had 80 Iranians. About 30 of them were billed as decision makers. You had some very pragmatic diplomats who had worked on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that deal signed by Barack Obama's administration back in 2018. And you had effectively nationalist firebrands who derided America, sneered at the idea of a deal. And what we've reported is that, these intra-Iranian disputes were so fractious that the Pakistani mediators at times had to spend as much time arbitrating amongst the Iranians as they did between the Iranians and the Americans. So you can see these huge splits even within Iran over how to proceed.
And how do they view President Trump right now? Perhaps they felt the brunt of the United States military, but in terms of his rhetoric and that he says we're close to a deal, the war is near the end. If we don't meet a deal by the end of the ceasefire, the bombs will start to fall again. He talked about wiping out an entire civilization. Do they view that all as bluster, or how are they reading President Trump in Iran?
I think here again it depends on which Iranians we're looking at, but by and large I share the assessment that Richard Haass made earlier, that the president has devalued the currency of these threats, because we have seen so many over the years, not just the months, over the years, which ultimately turn out to be completely baseless. And here I would just take a moment to remind people that back in 2020, I think it was, in President Trump's first term, he also threatened to bomb Iranian cultural sites, a threat that, of course, was met with, at the time, considerable disquiet within the Pentagon and many other departments because of the illegality that would involve. But, of course, he didn't follow through on it. You may recall he backed down from bombing Iran on that occasion when they had downed an American drone. And now, with so many deadlines passed, ignored, dismissed, I think the Iranians will recognize, for all the reasons we've been identifying, they will feel they have more staying power in this than the American side.
And Richard Haass, sort of playing on Shashank's headline, the question also could be asked, which America is Iran dealing with, meaning an America that goes to war and then threatens war crimes if they don't get their way. In the initial attack, I believe, wiped out a girls' school, but now literally threatening to decimate civilizations. People say, oh, he's just kidding, although I don't think that's the kind of kidding that you do in war, especially after the initial attack and what the repercussions were. But what does world support look like for this America?
International support?
Yeah.
It's thin on a generous assessment, in large part because, we haven't consulted.
Right.
Either about the war or about the blockade. The old line in diplomacy, if you want people involved in the landings, you got to bring them in on the takeoffs. Mm-hmm. We've not done that. They're uncomfortable with the policy. They also feel that they're the ones most affected by it. We have a much stronger energy position they do. So, so they look at this and they go, well, you Americans are somewhat insulated from this, yet you've put in motion a chain of events which are cratering our economy. Can I ask one question of Mr. Joshi? Because The Economist has done such good reporting on this, which is when people look at Iran, the big weakness seems to be the economy. If you look at even before the war, it was the Achilles heel of Iran. Currency was plummeting through the floor. The war has in many ways exacerbated it. To what extent does this give the United States a degree of leverage? Because then on top of that, you've obviously got the blockade. To what extent are there those on the Iranian side who are saying, even though we don't like the idea of compromising, in some ways, if we're going to preserve the 1979 revolution, we had better cut a deal because we're in trouble. What are you hearing about that? What's your take on that?
I think you're completely right, because, look, when we saw those mass protests earlier this year, they were not initially motivated by political or explicitly political circumstances. They were triggered by a sense of profound economic dysfunction and malaise, a sense that the currency was falling, a sense that purchasing power was declining, that Iranian jobs were far between. And this is an incredibly talented country, right? A lot of people with extremely well-educated backgrounds, higher education in good shape. This is why they can have such a flourishing nuclear program, for instance. Now, this is directly related to that split within the regime, because you have people like Abbas Araghchi, the foreign minister, and even Ghalibaf, the effective leader of this negotiating team, who is in some ways a hardliner, but says, look, we have to talk to the Americans. We have to seek sanctions relief. We have to seek the release of frozen assets, because this is the way we stabilize the regime in the longer run. But then you also have, of course, those in the Revolutionary Guards, Richard, who, as you know, in many ways have benefited from Iran's siege economy. They have benefited from control over smuggling routes, control over state enterprises. So I think that dispute over a mild glasnost, you could call it, or perestroika, I guess, an Iranian perestroika, and between a siege economy, very comfortable with relying on a more autarkic Iran, that dispute is playing out today. But I'm not convinced that the forces of openness are enough to give America leverage, at least not on the time frame that is relevant to this administration, before the midterms become uncomfortably close.
Defense editor at The Economist, Shashank Joshi, thank you so much for your insights this morning. Then one more angle to this. Another round of in-person talks between officials from Israel and Lebanon are set to take place Thursday at the State Department. That is according to the Times of Israel, citing an Israeli and U.S. official familiar with the matter. Israel's ambassador to the United States is expected to attend. Lebanon is reportedly sending its former ambassador to the United States after its current ambassador attended the first round of talks early last week. Those talks resulted in the ongoing 10-day ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon. Thursday's meeting would come days before that agreement is set to expire. We should note that Israel has continued attacks in South Lebanon, where it maintains a large military presence despite the truce.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're missing one of their principal parties called Hezbollah. So Israel and Lebanon can talk till the cows come home. But like you've had a state within a state for decades, and the state within a state is called Hezbollah. They're not directly part of that. And if the Israelis had such confidence in a peace with Lebanon, why would they be occupying such a big swath of their territory? So you can't. No one's going to sit here and argue against peace talks, but no one should argue or suggest that these are really significant. Quite honestly, they're not. And they're a reminder, one of the big issues that's against the backdrop of all this is Iranian support for proxy groups.
Right.
And it's not clear how you bring those into the negotiations. So what this sets up, quite interestingly, is the United States and Iran, imagine they can overcome their differences on the nuclear issue and the Strait. Then you have a whole set of issues that can't be resolved, which sets up all sorts of friction between the United States and Israel. Because Israel's going to want to continue the war to go after the proxies, and the United States is going to say, no, we want to have a ceasefire. We have the Strait open. We've got an acceptable outcome on the nuclear. So I would just say watch that space. It's an irony, given Israel's role, shall we say, in helping to bring this war about. And it could end in ways that lead Bibi Netanyahu and the Israelis extremely uncomfortable.
That's a super fascinating point in all of this. Just to go back into the negotiations one more time on the Strait of Hormuz, which you just mentioned, an outsider watching this realizes that Iran has discovered, perhaps woken up to the fact that it has this leverage point and it can, in fact, impact the world economy. So in this negotiation, it's what they've got. Why, if you're an Iranian negotiator, why would you ever give up that leverage?
Well, the main reason is the blockade, which is the reason that people like me proposed it in the first place, because Iran can't benefit from the ability to export. So that creates a kind of equilibrium there. And I think that gives them the incentive. It's also the reason, though, that I think it's probably impossible, Willie, to walk things back to exactly where they were 7 weeks ago. So we may have to think of some kind of a clever political scheme where we create a new governing table for the Strait. Iran sits at the table, so do all the other countries, the Saudis, the UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, and so forth, and they come up with some new mechanism. It's a little bit of a cover story. It's a facade. But if that's what allows the Iranians, if you will, to open the Strait and say they got something for it, it might be worth it. But I think it's going to. But the main thing is the economic pressure on them. The whole idea of open for all or close to all. Well, if it's close to all, their economy feels enormous pressure. So that's their incentive to go along.
All right.